Good evening, good afternoon, or good morning, everyone. My name is Gaia Molinaro, and today I'm going to present a project I've been working on for my bachelor dissertation at King's College London, actually, on the effects of social rewards on incidental episodic memory. So, for instance, if I smile more often, will you remember my presentation better? I'll begin by breaking down the keywords of my research. So first, what is episodic memory? Using Tulving's words, episodic memory is memory for happenings in particular places at particular times, or memory about the what, where, and where of specific events. It is a private collection of samples of the world. Your first time on the slopes, that boring violin lesson, that amazing pizza you had at the beach when you were 8. Episodic memory provides a framework for new memories. It allows us to make predictions about the future and decisions in the present, to interpret the past and communicate it to others. However, there's only so much we can remember, so it's crucial to set memory storage towards the important things. For example, we tend to have better memory for events during which our emotional state was high, for those that caught our attention, such as a cat in a conference, and for those that we were curious to learn about. However, it's at least as important to remember things that happened close to times when we received the reward, so that we can increase the chances that we would receive the same rewards again. This might be a primary reward, such as food, or a secondary reinforcer, like money, but we decided to focus on social rewards. Why? Well, first, we all know that humans are social animals, and it's really in the social context that we can explain the success of humans on Earth. The presence of others is known to influence our performance. Social rewards might be just as effective as other more studied kinds of rewards. But they're also very easy to deliver and cheap. Stimuli as simple as a smile can function as rewards. And perhaps social rewards are really something we want to protect these days between social distancing and wearing masks. So what's the incidental part about? Motivated learning has been extensively studied. However, we don't usually walk around trying to remember things. So it's important that the relationship between the rewards and the resources may only sometimes become evident in retrospect. So at least initially, it might be important to enhance memory for events that occurred around reward consumption with relatively little bias for their relevance. Incidental learning is learning that was neither intentionally motivated by an individual nor explicitly reinforced by external rewards. In experimental settings, incidental memory is usually measured through surprise memory tests, whereby participants are typically asked to recognize images of previously seen objects in state when they detect new ones. In this way, it is possible to measure the effects of rewards on memory without the confounding elements of selective attention and motivation. But how exactly is this supposed to work at the level of the brain? Well, John Lissman and colleagues proposed what they call the Penumbra hypothesis. They suggested that dopaminergic inputs coming from the midbrain, here in red, mark an event as salient, novel, or rewarding by signaling onto the hippocampus, here in blue, which is the key structure for episodic memory. So when memory for events that happen in those instances is encoded or consolidated, the process is further favored. For instance, when we are in a high curiosity state, memory is enhanced not only for what we learn, but also for whatever happens in between, which, as I said, we refer to as incidental. Our main aim was to test this effect on social rewards and episodic memory. In other words, do happy faces help us remember the space and time of events, even when they are absolutely neutral and completely unrelated to them? We also asked whether mood affects the relationship between social rewards and incidental memory. 46 human participants took part in our experiment and were included in the data. To model episodic memory, we used pairs of images appearing on an empty grid at specific locations and times, and smiling or neutral faces as are within subject's condition. The experiment was run over 2 consecutive days, a memory encoding task to be completed on day 1, and a surprise memory test on day 2. There were 2 types of memory tests, which I will explain as I go through the experimental design. We also had participants fill out a questionnaire about their mood, a scale called PANAS, which provides scores of positive and negative affects separately. I'm now going to show you an example trial. Let's start with the encoding task. After a fixation cross, a face, either neutral or smiling, appears on the screen. Then participants are asked to rate how friendly it looks to them. Next is the incidental event. On an empty grid, two objects appeared in sequence in different areas of the grid. To make sure the participants were paying attention to the event, we asked them a question on a detail related to one of the objects that had just appeared. For instance, did the popcorn bucket add stripes or spots on it? Then people viewed the same face as before and rated it again. This was mainly done to match another experiment running in parallel in our lab, so don't focus too much about it for now. The other trials would be exactly the same, but with different faces and different grids. On day 2 of the experiment, participants came back to the lab and were asked to discriminate between old grids and new ones. They were also asked how confident they were in their recollection. Some grids were left unchanged, but for others, the position in which the objects appeared were different. For example, did you notice that the popcorn bucket is now on the left? This was true in a version of the memory test, which we called the spatial manipulation. The other version had temporal manipulations, whereby not the position, but the order of appearance of the pair was inverted. So for instance, the hot dog would appear first and then the popcorn bucket. Note that each participant only had to complete one version of the test. Also note that the participants were never asked to pay attention to or memorize the features of the grid that were later asked about during the test. That is, the ones that changed time and space. My main outcome measures were D prime values, which are a measure of sensitivity based on hit and false alarm rates in the memory test. Reaction times and confidence levels were also analyzed. After extracting the raw data and calculating the variables of interest, I ran mixed effects ANOVA, independent t-tests, and paired t-tests as appropriate. I used the mood questionnaire scores to define groups of low versus high mood participants, and here are my main results. As you can see, the relationship between neutral and smiling D prime values is pretty linear, and in fact, participants were not better at discriminating grids that appeared after a social reward compared to those that weren't. In general, though, they found it much harder to remember information about time than space, as you can see on the right. They did much worse in general in the temporal test, which is here in yellow, compared to the spatial one in blue. What is interesting, though, is that there were interactions between mood at the time of encoding and the smiling versus neutral condition. Remember that the PANAS questionnaire gives positive and negative affect scores, so you could have high values for both scales, for example. They're not correlated. When I consider people who were on the low end dotted line of the positive affect scale, there actually was an effect of social rewards on memory performance. So the fact that we didn't observe an effect might be due to inter-subject variability on the mood scale. When we divided participants based on their negative affect scores, the interaction wasn't really significant. All in all, we were not able to confirm the main hypothesis, but before excluding social rewards as incidental episodic memory enhancers altogether, there are at least a couple of things that we could check. First, I would adjust the design so that instead of viewing the smiling or neutral face twice, the participants would actually see first a cue, indicating whether they're going to see a smiling or a neutral face. And then, as they learn which cue corresponds to which category of faces, this will put them in a state of reward anticipation. In fact, previous literature suggests that A, reward anticipation and consumption are characterized by different brain activation patterns, and B, reward prediction errors, which rely on both reward expectation and its actual value, are the real effectors for memory enhancement, not really reward outcome. In addition, it does seem that mood might be quite relevant in how we interpret facial expressions, how rewarding we find them, and how they affect memory. So I would run the experiment on a different population, or at least a larger one, so as to have more people with very low mood. As I told you before, the PANAS scale is made of both positive and negative affect scores, and the two do not correlate. When I selected a subset of people who had both low positive affect and high negative affect, these were my results. Unfortunately, selecting these participants according to only these conditions yielded only 11 of them, so it's hard to draw strong conclusions. Yet, as you can see, there was a strong significant difference between memory for events associated with the no reward versus reward condition. So it might be worth exploring the possibility that social reward affect people differently according to their mood, as this might have implications in how we treat patients with depression and other affective disorders. So what's the take-home message here? As we've seen, social rewards may not be strong enough to support incidental episodic memory by themselves, but they seem to have a decent effect on people who are at the very low end of the mood scale. And finally, I would just like to thank you for listening and my supervisor, Dr. Charlotte Russell, for giving me this opportunity. And I now welcome questions.
Thank you very much for that, Gaia. All right, everyone, we're open to anybody's questions. I'll give people a minute to send something in. And in the meantime, Gaia, I was wondering whether you have a thought as to why the temporal compared to spatial order was remembered differently.
Yeah, I found it actually very interesting that we saw such a big difference between the two tests in general. And it's funny because people thought that they did better in the temporal score because confidence level, I didn't show them here, but people were a lot more confident in the temporal task. And when I asked them about what they thought was changing, because we didn't tell them what would be the difference. For the spatial version, they were actually able to say, oh yeah, the location of the images was different. In the temporal test, they were just inventing stories to justify their answers, but they didn't really know what was going on. And I don't know exactly why people found it so hard, but I feel like in general we're often optimized to recognize spaces, but not really locate things in time. But it's definitely an interesting question.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point. So it seems like people, if I remember correctly, people perform better when there are temporal adjustments, or they can tell better, or they can, they perform better when there are temporal adjustments despite not knowing.
No, they do better on the spatial. They do better on the spatial task. So when
okay, so then it's consistent.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah, that's super interesting. And I see we have a question from Candace Wang. This person's wondering what you would predict would happen to memory results if you presented the objects at the same time as the face.
I think, again, I would see an effect of mood there because rewards and social rewards might actually be distracting, but perhaps not for everyone equally. So that people with very low mood might focus on the smile and be even more distracted by the stimulus. Yeah.
All right, thank you. And we have another question from Guillermo. What if you used videos instead of static images? Would you expect to be, what sort of changes might you expect?
I don't have an answer for that, but I think it's a great question and a way to go, especially if we're trying to measure episodic memory. It would be really interesting to use videos because those are much more similar to real life experiences than pictures of images appearing. So good question, yeah.
And that definitely makes sense. All right. I think we may be just about time to move on. I'm going to give people a few more seconds. If there are any final questions. All right, great, thank you. We'll transition now. So